second part of the talk, I will talk about the concept of human freedom. In the first part, we finished by saying that human freedom is, for the early Wittgenstein, very vague, very ambiguous, very ambivalent, and probably not the most important concept for philosophical thinking. In Continental Philosophy, however, human freedom becomes a central issue. I will say something about Existentialist philosophy, very important school in 20th century philosophy. Let me start with an illustration. The movie 5 Easy Pieces, shot in 1970 by the director Bob Rafelson. In the movie we see Bobby. Bobby is the protagonist, played by Jack Nicholson. Bobby is an upper-class dropout. He's very unhappy, he's restless, he's frustrated about his job, frustrated about his family, he's very disappointed in his girlfriend. Now, the most famous scene is the final scene of 5 Easy Pieces. Bobby and his girlfriend Rayette pull up at a gas station to get some gas. Rayette walks into the store to get something, and Bobby, he simply lets go. He drops everything, he leaves behind his wallet, he leaves behind his jacket, he hitches a ride with a truck headed north. It seems that he's so frustrated that he's on the lookout for what? For freedom, for genuine freedom. Now, genuine freedom is something that's very important for the school of philosophy that we call existentialist philosophy. They have something to say about those problems that Bobby experiences and the solutions that he so desperately longs for. The most famous philosopher in existentialism is undoubtedly Jean-Paul Sartre, a French philosopher sometimes called the last great intellectual, who had something to say about just about everything, ranging from the nature of human imagination to political issues. Now, Sartre has published a book called Existentialism is a Humanism that is founded in one simple sentence. The sentence is as follows: existence precedes essence. This sounds complicated, but it might not necessarily be so. If we take a glass, for instance, if we take a simple glass, an object, we can say that the essence of the glass precedes its existence. This means that the person who has produced the glass, the person who created the glass, that he or she knows in advance what the glass will be like. He or she has an image, a view on what the glass must look like and what tasks it will need to perform. Now, with human beings, this is not the case. Human beings are free, are absolutely free, says Sartre. Human beings have an innate freedom and they're not predetermined by such an essence. You might say that the essence of a human being is precisely that he does not have an essence, that the existence of an individual is fashioned by the individual himself. Existence, according to the existentialists, is a project. It is dependent on and determined by one's own decisions, one's own choices, one's own actions. Now, I think it is clear that such arguments, such a philosophical framework, carries within itself a very affirmative core. It is an appeal to action, an appeal to deciding about one's own existence. It is also, in Sartre's case, a critique against what he calls mauvaise foi, or bad faith. Sartre denounces bad faith because he says bad faith is something like this. We blame something else, for instance, biological or societal forces, for our own choices. We look at biological or societal forces as powers that we can't control, that overwhelm our thoughts, that overwhelm our actions, and that make it a bit easy for us to put the blame elsewhere. Now, these kinds of simple excuses, they deny our humanity. They make us look a bit like a thing, like an object. They make us look like automatons. They make our actions look mechanical, as if there is no freedom that underlies our decisions. And it is a bit self-deceiving and it's inauthentic, according to Sartre. He gives us an example. The example is a cafe waiter. A cafe waiter, one that Sartre might have seen in one of the famous cafes in Paris that he frequented with his wife Simone de Beauvoir. A cafe waiter can sometimes be a bit too forward, a bit too fluent, too polite. Sometimes Sartre says such a cafe waiter denies his own being an individual, as if he seems to merge with the type, with the ideal of what a waiter is, and he denies thereby his own humanity. It is simply too perfect, his way of behaving, his way of being forthcoming and forward. But is it this simple? If we return to, for instance, Bobby in 5 Easy Pieces, isn't there something more fundamental at stake there? Okay, Bobby seems like an existentialist individual who refuses to identify himself with all those social patterns, all those moral norms that people force upon him. Okay, looks for an absolute sense of freedom, genuine freedom. But it's also a bit tragic if you think about it. It's actually also a symptom of a psychological malaise. He feels quite miserable. And this dimension of despair, this dimension of anxiety is crucial to existentialist philosophy. If we look at Sartre's colleague, the German existentialist philosopher Martin Heidegger, that's what he is most known for. In his book Being and Time, Martin Heidegger talks about Angst. Somehow the German word sounds a bit more convincing than the English word anxiety. Angst or anxiety, in psychoanalysis, describes a feeling that can be differentiated from fear. Fear has an object, you're afraid of, say, dogs, but anxiety is a bit undetermined. It does not have an object, and the problem with anxiety is that we don't even know what we are truly anxious about. So liberty, freedom, according to existentialism, goes hand in hand with anxiety, with despair. I think Bobby in 5 Easy Pieces really testifies to a very fundamental form of despair. It goes hand in hand with individual loneliness, solitariness, isolation. So the affirmative core of existentialist thinking also has a very negative side to it. It has to do with this feeling of being alone. There is a very famous and very funny American director, comedian Woody Allen, and he coins the paradox that underlies existentialist thinking as follows. Life is full of misery, Woody Allen says, full of loneliness, full of suffering, and it is over much too soon. He's totally right, of course. The big problem with human existence is its finitude, is mortality, the question of death. The question of death will not ever be solved. That's, of course, something that existentialist thinking agrees with. But existentialists, they do not see death as a merely negative event. They see death as the beginning of philosophical meaning. Because if you think about it, it is because we're mortal, because our lives are finite, that we won't be able to do everything we want. Because we're bound to die at some point, because we won't go on living forever, our decisions matter. It's this finitude that gives a sharpness to our actions. We'd better get serious about our actions if life will at some point stop. So death is not a negative event, but a source of philosophical meaning for the existentialists. And what matters the most for existentialists is that individuals learn to relate to their death. And they call death a very individual event. Martin Heidegger, for instance, says, in every case, death is mine. Individuals always die their own individual death. Now, all of this leaves us with one important question: the limits of freedom. If death is not even the antithesis of freedom, does it mean that freedom is unlimited, that there are no borders to freedom? Or are we wrong, and is there something like an essential limit to the concept of liberty, to the concept of human freedom? Dear Miss Arendt, I must come see you this evening and speak to your heart. Everything should be simple and clear and pure between us. Only then will we be worthy of having been allowed to meet. You are my pupil and I your teacher. But that is only the occasion for what has happened to us. These are the first lines of the first letter written by Martin Heidegger to his pupil Hannah Arendt. This is 1925.
This is a love affair which is at the heart of continental philosophy in the 20th century. It is a very unlikely love affair. Unlikely because Martin Heidegger, the professor, is 20 years older than Hannah Arendt, the pupil. Very unlikely because Hannah Arendt is a Jewish scholar, whereas Martin Heidegger will be involved with the fascist regime. After the Second World War, Hannah Arendt will remain a refugee. She will move to the United States and she will spend her entire life there. She will become famous for her analysis of the famous Eichmann trial, a prominent Nazi official. And she will also be famous for her analysis of totalitarianism, both fascist and communist totalitarianism. Martin Heidegger, on the other hand, will remain in his native country, Germany. He will remain loyal to this country. And he's criticized because only at the very end of the Second World War will he hand in his party membership for the fascist party. He will become a rector in 1933 of the University of Freiburg, and he will resign a year later. After the Second World War, Hannah Arendt will defend her former lover and her former professor, and she will appear in front of the denazification committee that criticizes Martin Heidegger. Karel Jaspers, another student of Heidegger, will not do the same. He will criticize his former professor. The correspondence will last 50 years. Hannah Arendt will die first. She will die in 75. Her former lover and her former professor Martin Heidegger will die in 76, less than 6 months after Arendt.